একটা prompt যেটা শুনতে পেলে এটা আমাদের রেকর্ডিং স্টার্ট হবে।
Yes, sir, got it.
Okay, so spinal nerves naming is I mean even more easier to remember than the names of the cranial nerves. But make sure when you are remembering the cranial nerves, you remember it exactly in the order as I have named it in the video. Okay, that order concept is equally applicable for the spinal nerves as well. So how is that order equally applicable for the spinal nerves? Let us have a look. First, let us walk through our old concept of the vertebral column. So with this color, I am trying to show here the individual vertebra of all the 33 vertebrae that make up the vertebral column. So individual vertebrae are placed one on top of the another, right? That is how the vertebrae are placed. What you can see here, we can say that this is the body of the vertebrae. What is this? This is the body of the vertebrae. I have probably not discussed the structure of a typical vertebrae. Let me just brief that structure that will help you to understand the spinal nerves naming in better way. That is, if we take a vertebrae, suppose this is the shape of the vertebrae. The front part, I mean, this shape is known as the body, and this is a solid part. So the body of vertebrae is solid, right? Now the back part do have an arch kind of thing, and having an arch kind of thing makes a kind of hollow. So what I am trying to say is that this thickness is bony. So all that area that I have shaded, all that area is made up of bone. But the point on which I am putting some yellow dots, this point is hollow. Clear? And in addition to that, if you look into the sides of the vertebrae, the sides are having processes. Not only the sides, even the top of the arch do also have a process. So the sides are known as the transverse process. Okay. And the top one is known as the spinous process of the vertebrae. So this is the typical vertebrae. Now there is variations among the cervical vertebrae or the vertebrae that makes up the thoracic part of the vertebral column or the lumbar part. There are variations. Sacrum is obviously a hugely different thing from this, being all the vertebrae fused together. The coccyx as well, having all the vertebrae very small size. But this is the typical vertebrae. Now, why is this structure of the vertebrae significant to understand the spinal nerve? Because the origin of the spinal nerve is from spinal cord, right? Now the structure spinal cord, let me pick another color to show the location of the spinal cord. With this blue color, I am trying to show you the spinal cord, which is present inside this arch, the vertebral arch. Clear? Now, let's take this diagram in which I have shown that one vertebrae placed on top of another. So if one vertebrae is placed on top of one another, doesn't it form a single whole column? A column is formed by placing one structure on the top of another structure. So this is how columns are formed. Now, if any part of the structures be hollow, that hollow would also forms a continuous part that in one way is going to give rise to a canal. Did you understand this concept? If I draw another vertebrae out here, suppose I'm drawing another vertebrae. So this is having the vertebral arch. And accordingly, this will be the body. This is the transverse process. One of the transverse process cannot be seen. So this is the body of the second vertebrae. So let me shadow up the parts which are bony. And again, let me put yellow dots to the part which is hollow. This is the hollow part. And inside that hollow part, I will see again a segment of the spinal cord. So this is spinal cord. This also is the spinal cord. Understood? Basically, the spinal cord is a continuous structure. I can place another vertebrae onto the front of this first vertebrae, or to the back of the second vertebrae, I can place another vertebrae. So all the vertebrae are placed in a continuous form so that the arches now become a continuous hollow canal. Did you understand how is the vertebral canal formed?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So inside that vertebral canal, what is found is this continuous structure again, and this is the spinal cord. Now, the thing is, I can draw that spinal cord similarly in this columnar format. How? By showing you the areas that are present in between the two consecutive vertebrae. So suppose this is the first vertebrae, this one is the second vertebrae. So in between these two consecutive vertebrae, there is a gap. Normally, this gap cannot be seen because in between these two vertebrae from the front, there is discs of connective tissue. We call that as IVD, intervertebral discs. I think you have heard the name of a disease called slipped disc. People who are in the practice of carrying very heavy weights, they sometimes suffer from this problem of slip disc. Slip disc basically is the slippage of the IVD, right? So you cannot see the spinal cord as long as the discs are present. Consider that I have removed the disc. On removal of the discs, the spinal cord will now become visible. But part of the spinal cord is not visible because in the front of that spinal cord, the body, this body is present, body of the individual vertebrae. Are you understanding?
Please, sir, repeat.
The spinal cord is a continuous structure that we have already seen in this particular diagram. Now, if I am keeping my eye in this position, if this be my eye, and trying to see the spinal cord, would I be able to see the spinal cord as long as the body of the vertebrae be present in front of the spinal cord? Spinal cord সামনে যতক্ষণ the body is present, আমি কি spinal cord টাকে দেখতে পারবো? Is it possible?
No, sir.
No,
দেখতে পারবো না। But যেই সমস্ত জায়গাগুলোতে the vertebra is not present, মানে এই জায়গাগুলোতে, in this area, since the vertebral body is not present, so the spinal cord would become visible.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in between these two vertebrae, the spaces on the sides are known as IVF. No, IVF doesn't stand for in vitro fertilization. No, here it stands for intervertebral foramen. So what is foramen? If you have the memory of your lessons of the skull, then you will come to know that foramen basically is an opening. Opening of what? Opening of the skull cavity. You remember now?
yes,
So
sir.
foramen is the opening of the skull cavity. Remember? Similarly, these foramens can be considered to be opening in the vertebral column. See, the skull is a continuous cavity, is having the continuous cavity, the cranial cavity. And in this continuous cranial cavity, in the walls of the cranial cavity, there are a few openings. Similarly, if we have to consider the entire vertebral column, in between the two consecutive vertebrae, these are the openings, and thus these openings are known as the intervertebral foramen. Understood? Why is this known as the intervertebral foramen? Now, similar to the cranial cavity, foramens are basically the passageways, path, route, from which the nerves, the blood vessels, the lymphatic ducts can pass through. Some of the nerves would either exit the cranial cavity, other nerves will enter the cranial cavity. Similarly, this spinal cord is having the intervertebral foramen as the only spaces from where the spinal nerve can emerge out on both the sides. Thus, these levels of the spinal cord are known as what? Spinal segments. Understood now? The concept of spinal segments.
Yes, sir.
Now, our primary topic was the naming of the spinal nerves. Now, the naming of the spinal nerves is made after the spinal segments. So, how do we name the spinal segments? We know that in the vertebral column, we are having cervical segments, we are having thoracic segments, we are having lumbar segments, sacral segments, and coccygeal segments. We all know this. Following that same principle of naming individual segments of the vertebral column, we do also have the segmentations of the spinal cord. So, part of the spinal cord present in the cervical area would be considered as the cervical spinal segment. Understood? Yes or no? I will show you a different diagram if not, but as of now, did you at least take the concept of what the cervical spinal segment is? Now, as I have illustrated here, that segments are the areas in between the bony structures. We know that in the neck area, we are having, from the vertebral column perspective, we are having 7 cervical vertebrae. Right? We know that. But the thing is, when you speak of cervical nerves, the number is not anymore 7, rather it is but 8. Why 8? Because if you consider the spaces in between the two vertebrae, you will find that the number of spaces is 8. Now, on the top of the first vertebra, what will you have? Would you not have the skull out here? On the top of the first cervical vertebra, there would be a skull. So there would be definitively a space in between the skull on top and the vertebra on bottom. So I'm speaking of this particular space, from which nerves can originate and get distributed to the rest of the body. So thus, this is to be considered as the first spinal segment. Now, for every other opening that we have in between the two consecutive vertebrae, we will accordingly go on numbering each of the spinal segment. Did you understand how the number is becoming 8? So 8 spinal segment means there will be 8 spinal nerves. Did you understand now? Clear?
Yes.
Now, how to label
Yes, sir.
individual nerves? Labeling individual nerves is even actually very more easier. How is that? We are having 8 cervical spinal segments. That means we are having 8 cervical spinal nerves as well. 8 cervical spinal nerves. Now, of this, we will consider the topmost one as the first cervical spinal nerve. So the topmost would be considered as the first, because the counting follows in the direction downward. From up towards the down is the direction of our counting. So when you say the first cervical vertebra, we are referring to the topmost cervical vertebra.
Sir, why called as a cervical survival vertebra?
Cervix means neck. This is a Latin word, cervix. That means neck. What is the meaning of this word neck? Neck means a narrowed area. If this is a swollen area, then there will be a narrowed area. Now, this small narrowed part is to be considered as cervix. So exactly for this reason, the word cervix is not only used to refer to the neck that we can see from outside. The female reproductive organ do also have a part that is known as cervix. That is the narrowed part present below the main body of the uterus. Cervical cancer, I think you have heard this term before. That is one of the most common site of cancer for the female. So cervix means a relatively narrowed area present in between two broad areas. That is the concept of cervix. Now, since this head is a broad area, and again this chest is even the broader area, in between these two broad areas, the narrowed area is to be termed as cervix. Now, cervical vertebrae means vertebrae present in the neck area. Cervical spinal segment means that particular spinal segment or segments which is present again in the neck area. Cervical spinal nerves means nerves originating out from the cervical spinal segments. Very easy to understand now. Clear? But the word cervix refers to a narrowed part present in between relatively broad parts. That narrowed part is known here as cervix. Clear? Priyanka?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So see, I was explaining the order of numbering the spinal segments and the spinal nerves. That is the topmost to be termed as the number one, first one. So the topmost spinal segment that ideally is present in between the skull, to be more specific, the occipital bone of the skull on the top, and the atlas, that is the first cervical vertebrae, on the bottom. So here in this area, since the first cervical spinal segment is present, we will refer to this as the first cervical spinal nerves. That is true. But in short, we do not use this entire word. Rather, we go for writing it as simply C1. That refers to the first cervical spinal segment, or it can even refer to the first pair of the spinal nerve. You do understand now? How do we refer this individual nerve as? So if we follow the same convention, we will have the next nerve that is present just below the C1 would be the C2, C3, C4, C5, 4, 5, C6, C7, and we should not end at C7 because we know that the number of cervical spinal nerves is not 7, but the total number is what? 8. So we are having these kind of notations used to indicate the individual spinal nerves. Is this clear now, Shayan, how to know nomenclature? Okay. Following again that similar convention, we can now move on to the next segment of the vertebral column or the spinal segments, that is the thoracic one. So for thoracic one, we are using this alphabet T. Accordingly, by that same convention, we will write it as T1, T2, T3, T4, dot, 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 dot. I am not repeating that same thing again, but I am writing the final thoracic spinal segment, which is giving out the T12 pair of nerves. So this is a notation. This T12 is basically a notation that is referring to which particular. Accordingly, if we follow the next segment, that is the, say for example, the lumbar one. So L1, L2, L3, L4, L5. For the sacrum, the alphabet to be used, I think you probably have guessed it. The alphabet to be used will be, again, S this time, because S is the starting alphabet for the word sacrum. So S1, S2, S3, S4, S5. One last thing is the last spinal nerve, that is coccyx. Now here again is the problem. I think you are already familiar with the problem that the word coccyx starts with that same alphabet with which the word cervix starts. So both these words starts with C. So in order to distinguish and discriminate, to refer to cervix, instead of writing simply C, we do also write along with C a small O, which indicates that it is referring, this notation is referring to the coccygeal spinal segment. Incidentally, in the coccygeal, we are having only one pair of nerves. So CO1 or simply CO nerve, it refers to, these two notations refer to the coccygeal spinal. So this is how the different spinal nerves are basically named. And that entirely is now on your screen. Whatever doubts you're having, you can now raise your doubts.